The water came up out of the ground where nothing had any right to be, a dark seam, widening in the pale gravel, while the ribs and hide steers stood over it with their muzzles dripping, and the whole valley below lay cracked and yellow and dying. She stood at the top of the draw, with her hands hanging empty at her sides, and watched a thing happen that every wise head in the county had sworn could not happen, and she did not shout or run. She only counted the animals, the way she counted everything, and thought that the arithmetic had changed. 2 summers earlier, on the day she signed her name to the bill of sale, the same men who would come begging up that draw had told her she'd bought a graveyard on the hoof. Let it be said plainly at the start, the way the old ones told a thing, so you'd remember the shape of it. There was a woman named Della Rourke, and in the spring of 1886, she was 24 years old and alone in the world, which in that country and that year was 3 separate crimes a person could commit against the good opinion of their neighbors. Her father had gone under the winter before, coughed himself thin and then gone, and left her 40 acres of the worst ground in the mussel shell breaks, a lean-to barn, a plow horse named Solomon with 1 cloudy eye, and $11 folded into a coffee tin. The good bottom land, the meadow, with the spring on it, that had gone to pay the doctor in the store. And what was left to Della was the piece the surveyors had laughed at, a long tilted apron of gravel and sage that climbed toward a broken rimrock and held no water anyone had ever found. Land was worth what it would grow, and hers would grow nothing but the opinion of the town, that she would not last the year. She might have sold and gone east to a mill town and disappeared, and no one would have marked it. That was the sensible course. And the storekeeper's wife told her so with the particular tenderness people use when they are enjoying your defeat. But Della had spent her whole life watching the small economy other folks walked past without seeing, the way water beaded on one slope and ran off another, the way cattle chose one patch of ground to lie on and shunned the next. And she had a stubbornness in her that was not loud, but was very deep, banked down low like a coal under ash. She stayed. And in the last week of April, when the trail herds began coming up from Texas and the shipping pens at the railhead filled with the bawling and the dust, she took her $11 and walked the 6 miles to the pens to see what a poor woman could buy for almost nothing. What almost nothing bought, it turned out, was death waiting to fall down. A drover named Cobb had a cut of 18 steers. He'd trailed up hard through a dry stretch, and they had come to the end of the drive with their hip bones standing out like tent poles and their hides hanging loose as wet washing. 2 had the scours. 1 walked, with its head low and swaying. Cobb meant to knock them and sell the hides, because a buyer named Aldous Frayne, who bought most of the beef in that country and set most of the prices, had looked them over and offered $1 a head and a sneer, and $1 a head was not worth the powder. So when the thin young woman in her father's coat stopped at the rail and looked a long time at the ruined animals, Cobb spat and said she could take the lot for $50, knowing full well she did not have $50, saying it the way men say a thing to be rid of a person. She did not have $50, she had 11, and here is where the tale first turns. Small and quiet, on a thing that cost nothing. Old Pyotr Danko was standing at the pens, an immigrant from the far side of the world who had homesteaded the sage flat next to hers, and whom the town called the Crazy Pole and left alone. He had watched her look at the steers, and he had watched her look not at their ribs, but at their feet, at the way they set them, and something in that looking made him step up beside her. "Buy them," he said in his slow, graveled English. "I lend you the rest. A beast is not dead until it is dead." His countrymen, he said, had a saying that the land keeps its own counsel and pays out only to the one who waits. She looked at him, and she looked at the steers, and she did the arithmetic in her head, the feed and the risk and the near certainty of loss, and against all of it she set one thing she had noticed that no one else had troubled to notice. She took the loan. She paid Cobb $50 for 18 starving steers, and the drover laughed so hard he had to hold the rail, and by evening the whole town knew, and the whole town agreed she had lost what little mind a motherless girl could be expected to have. What she had noticed was this: when the other buyers looked at Cobb's steers, they saw only the flesh that wasn't there, the beef that wouldn't weigh. But Della had watched them at the trough and at the dust, and she had seen that under the starvation, the frames were big and the legs were sound, and the eyes, on 16 of the 18, were clear. They were not sick animals. They were hungry animals, which is a wholly different thing, and hunger can be answered where sickness sometimes cannot. Frayne had priced them as carcasses. She had priced them as cattle that had simply not yet been fed. It is easier to believe a thing is ruined than to do the patient work of finding out whether it is only starved, and the difference between those two beliefs was that spring, exactly what stood between Della Rourke and everyone who laughed at her. Getting them home to the gravel apron took 2 days, because they could not be driven fast, and one of the scoured steers lay down in the road on the second morning, and she thought that was the beginning of the end. She'd been promised. But Pyotr showed her how to mix a gruel of oats and a little salt, and hand it to a downed beast off a wooden paddle, patient as feeding a sick child, and by noon, the steer was up. She lost only one that first week, the swaying one that had something broken in it past mending, and she skinned it herself with her jaw set hard, and sold the hide for 80 cents, and put the 80 cents against Pyotr's loan, because a debt was a thing you paid down from the very first coin or it grew teeth. 17 left. She began to count them every dawn and every dusk. 17, 17, the number a small drumbeat under everything she did. She had no meadow and no hay money, and this was the trap the town expected to close on her, for you cannot feed 17 steers on sage and gravel. But Della had been raised on that broken ground, and she knew what the surveyors had not stayed long enough to learn, that the tilted apron caught the runoff of the whole rimrock above it, and that in the folds and the little draws where the water sheeted down after the spring rains and then vanished, the grass came up thick and green for a few weeks, and then browned off unused because no one grazed it. Free feed, standing there every spring and dying every summer for want of a mouth. She moved the steers up the draws, a few days here, a few days there, following the green, the way she'd watched wild things follow it, and she saved what little cash she had for the dead months. By June, the ribs were softening under the hides. By July, you could not have called them fat, but you could no longer call them dying, and a man passing on the road stopped his wagon to look twice, and Della felt the first hard, warm coal of it in her chest. The private joy of being right where everyone had sworn she was wrong, and she told no one. She banked it down under the ash and went on counting. 17. Now, the trouble with a woman succeeding quietly is that the town does not stay quiet. When the mockery of April did not come true, it curdled, the way it will, into something meaner. All this Frayne heard that the Rourke girls' throwaway steers were putting on weight on ground that grew nothing, and Frayne was a man who did not like to be shown a thing he had priced at $1 and been wrong about. He was a heavy, smiling man with clean hands and a gold watch chain, and he had a way of arriving at a place with concern arranged on his face like a Sunday collar. He drove out to the gravel apron 9 miles in August, when the county was starting to talk about how dry the summer was running, and he leaned on his buggy and looked at the 17 steers and told Della, in a voice full of false warmth, that a young woman alone couldn't be expected to carry cattle through what was coming. He'd take them off her hands. $6 a head. A kindness, he said. Given the winter and the loans, a person in her position surely carried. $6 a head was $102 for animals she'd bought for less than $3 apiece, and a year before, she might have grabbed it with both hands. But Della had learned to hear the thing, under the words the way she'd learned to read the ground. Frayne was not offering out of kindness. A man does not drive 9 miles in August to do a kindness to a girl he'd laughed at in April. He was offering because he had seen, before she'd let herself fully see it, that these were going to be very good steers, and he wanted them cheap before she found it out. She thanked him, and she said the steers weren't for sale, and she watched the smile stay fixed on his face while his eyes went flat and cold, and she understood she had made an enemy of the man who set the prices in that country. She counted the steers again after his dust had settled, 17, and she thought quietly that a thing is only worth what others will pay, and that Aldous Frayne had just told her, without meaning to, exactly how much these were worth. She let the coal burn a little higher under the ash, and she said nothing to anyone. That was the summer the water began, though she did not know it was water at the time. In the deepest of the draws, the long one that ran up under the rimrock, the steers had taken to pawing and standing about, a low spot in the gravel where the grass grew greenest longest. Della thought at first they liked the shade of the cutbank there, but one morning in September, she went up and found the gravel dark and damp under their hooves in a patch the size of a wagon bed, and when she knelt and pressed her hand flat to it, the wet came up cool between her fingers. She dug down with the toe of her boot, and the water sat in the hole, clear, no bigger than a coin, and then a second coin, and she knelt there a long while with her heart going hard, because water on that dry apron was the one thing everyone, her father included, had sworn was not there. She told Pyotr, and only Pyotr, and the old man came and knelt beside her and pressed his own hand to the gravel, and was quiet a long time. "A seep," he said at last. "The rimrock catches the snow and lets it down slow through the stone, and here, where the gravel is loose, it finds the air. The cattle smelled it before you saw it." He looked at her with his old pale eyes. "Do not tell the town," he said. "A man like Frayne, if he knows you have water, he will want the water. Keep it banked." So she dug it out a little and shored the hole with flat stones, and let it be a slow, cool eye of water in the driest ground in the county, and she kept it a secret, the way she kept everything low under the ash. Through the fall the steers grew, and the seep grew with them, or seemed to, widening as they pawed and drank at it, until it made a little pool a man could dip a bucket into. Della hauled a cull load of the 8 best steers to the railhead in October, and here came the second turning of the tale, the one that opens a door. There was a buyer down from the city that week, a beef contractor named Halverson, who supplied the mining camps and the railroad crews, a stranger to the county's opinions and unimpressed by Frayne's grip on the prices. Halverson walked the length of Della's 8 steers and put his hands on them, felt the spring of the ribs and the depth through the heart and the hard, clean muscle over the loin, and he stopped and looked at her the way a man looks who has found something he wasn't expecting. "Where did you grow these?" he said. "On gravel," she said. He didn't believe her, and he didn't much care, because a good beast is a good beast wherever it stood. He gave her $31 a head, more than 5 times what Frayne had offered, and it was more money than Della Rourke had held in her life, and she paid off the last of Pyotr's loan that same afternoon, and put the rest in the bank in Roundup under her own name, and walked out into the street, a woman with money and no debt, which in that town was a 4th crime, and the worst of all. The town noticed now. You cannot bring home the price of 8 prime steers and keep the town from noticing. The storekeeper's wife found reasons to be warm. The men at the pens stopped laughing when she passed and started watching, some of them sour and some of them thoughtful, and 1 or 2 of the poorer ones, the small homesteaders who scratched at ground nearly as bad as hers, came out quietly to ask how she'd done it, and to those Della told the truth. Because a thing you know is not made smaller by sharing it. She told them about grazing the runoff draws, about answering hunger with patience, instead of the knock on the head, about pricing a beast for what it could become, instead of what it was. Some of them tried it, and some of them didn't, but the ones who did began to prosper a little, and a thing began to grow around Della that she had never had, which was not respect exactly, not yet, but the leading edge of it. All this Frayne watched all of this from town with his flat, cold eyes, and his fixed smile, and he began, in the low, careful way of such men to whisper, there was something wrong with the Rourke ground. He let it be known. Nobody grew fat cattle on gravel by honest means. Maybe she was watering them somewhere she shouldn't, off some other man's land. Maybe worse. It is a strange and ugly truth that a town will forgive you for failing, but will hunt for a reason to condemn you for succeeding. And Frayne knew that truth and worked it like a man working a splinter, deeper into a thumb. Then came the dry year, and the tale turned hard, the way it always turns when the land decides to speak in earnest. The winter of 1888 went by with almost no snow, and the spring rains that always sheeted down the rimrock and greened the draws simply did not come. April was dust. May was dust and a hot wind out of the south that never let up, and the creeks that fed the bottomland, the good land, The land that had been taken from Della to pay her father's debts, those creeks dropped and stank, and then stopped. By June, the county was cracking open, the bottomland meadows that everyone had always counted on, the sure ground, the ground the surveyors prized, turned to yellow straw, and then to bare dirt, because a meadow lives on the creek, and the creek was gone. The men who had good land watched their good land die, and the men with cattle on it watched the cattle walk the fences, bawling for water that wasn't in the wells or the sloughs or anywhere the eye could find. Frayne had bought heavy that spring, hundreds of head on the strength of the bottomland grass, and now he stood to lose all of it. And a hungry man is dangerous, but a hungry rich man is worse, because he has the means to make his fear other people's problem. And up on the gravel apron, the ground everyone had called a graveyard, the Seep ran on. The rimrock held its slow, deep water, above the reach of any drought, and let it down through the stone the way it had for longer than there had been men to laugh. And the little eye of water Della and the steers had opened became, that terrible summer, the only living water for miles. She woke each morning to the fact of it and could hardly believe it. The cool, clear pool in the dead gray country. Her steers, 51 head now with the increase, and the culls she'd bought back cheap from broke men, standing fat and slow in the one green fold left in all that dying. The whole fortune of the valley had inverted in a single stroke of weather. The worthless land was the only land worth anything, and the water no one believed was. There was the only water there was, and the woman they'd all agreed would not last the year stood at the top of her draw and understood, with a strange cold clarity, that she now held the lives of the very people who had laughed at her in the palm of her hand. They came, of course. Hunger changes a town, and thirst changes it faster. First, the small homesteaders, hats in their hands, the ones she'd already helped, asking if they might water a few head at her seep. And to those she said yes before they'd finished asking, and Pyotr rigged a trough and a line of split logs to carry the overflow down to a second pool, so the pawing cattle wouldn't foul it. Then the middling men, prouder, who had mocked her at the pens and now stood at her gate, looking anywhere but at her face. And to those she also said yes, and named no price, and asked no penance, though she saw how it cost their pride to drink from the well of the woman they'd written off. She watered their stock, and she let them fill barrels for their families, and the little apron of gravel that couldn't grow a graveyard's worth of grass became, that summer, the thing that kept a whole neighborhood of people and animals alive. She counted them all now, not just her own steers, but the borrowed herds, and the barrels, and the gaunt children who came with the barrels, and the arithmetic of survival she'd carried alone for 2 years became, without her ever announcing it, the arithmetic of a community. Now here is where the true weight of the tale sits, on the choice a person makes when the world has finally handed them the whip. Della could have sold that water. A pool that keeps stock alive in a killing drought is worth, to a man watching his cattle die, very nearly anything he owns, and there were those in the county, Frayne, loudest among them, who would have understood it perfectly if she had charged $1 a head a day and grown rich off the ruin of the men who ruined her father's name and mocked her own. The whole shape of the last 2 years, every laugh at the pens, and every whisper in town, and every cold smile from a heavy man on a buggy, all of it seemed to lean her toward the simple justice of squeezing them now that she could. It would not even have been called cruelty. It would have been called business, and a thing is only worth what others will pay, and they would have paid everything. But Della had learned something on that gravel that Frayne, with all his prices, had never learned. She had learned that the land keeps its own counsel and pays out only to the one who waits, and that a person who is paid out abundantly and hoards it against the hungry has misunderstood entirely what the paying was for. So she charged nothing, and in the charging of nothing, she did a thing far cleverer and far kinder than revenge. She let it be known quietly through the small men who came and went that the Rourke Seep was open to any neighbor who kept the peace of it, who took his turn and fouled no water, and helped shore the pools and fed a paddle of gruel to the weakest of another man's downed stock the way she'd once been shown. She made the water a common thing, a thing the neighborhood tended together, and in doing so, she bound the whole scattered, prideful, quarreling country into a single body around a single pool, and a town so bound does not easily go back to laughing at the woman at the center of it. She had refused to be one person alone against the county. Instead, she had made the county need to stand together and put herself, without ever raising her voice, at the heart of the standing. Aldous Frayne could not abide it. A free thing cannot be cornered, and a man whose whole power lay in setting prices found himself standing at the edge of a water he could not buy, could not sell, and could not control, watching his own herds die on the dead bottomland, while the woman he'd tried to cheat, for $6 a head, watered half the county for nothing, and grew in their eyes by the day. So he did the last thing such men do when the honest world slips their grip. In the black end of July, he sent 2 riders up the draw in the dark to foul the Seep, to run a barrel of coal oil into the pool and poison the one water that was keeping the neighborhood alive, reasoning, in the twisted arithmetic of a cornered greedy man, that if no one had water, then his loss would be everyone's loss, and his failure would be swallowed in the general ruin. But he had forgotten, as such men always forget, how many people now had a stake in that ground. 2 of the small homesteaders were camped by the lower pool that night with their thirsty stock, and they heard the horses, and they saw the barrel, and they raised the whole watching neighborhood with a gunshot and a shout, and Frayne's riders bolted and left the barrel, and, in their panic, left a saddle blanket with Frayne's own brand corner-stitched into it, the mark of the very man whose cattle they'd been hired off. There was no need for a sheriff, in the end, though the sheriff came. The county tried Aldous Frayne in the way a county truly tries a man, which is not in a courtroom, but in its own regard, all at once and without appeal. They stood him at the edge of the pool he'd tried to poison, with the blanket in the dirt and his own brand facing up at him, and they let the silence do the work. He tried the smile, and the false warmth, and the talk of a young woman alone who surely couldn't understand these matters, and it all fell off him into the dust, because there was no one left who believed it. His name, which had set the prices in that country for 15 years, was worth nothing by morning. The buyers who deferred to him no longer. He sold out that autumn at a loss, and left the mussel shell, and the tail does not follow him, because the tail was never about him. A greedy man is only ever the weather a better story happens in. And Del O'Rourke came through the dry year, and out the far side of it, and the rains returned the next spring, the way they always do once the land has finished saying what it meant to say, and the bottom land greened up again, and the creeks ran and the county went on. But nothing went back to the way it had been, because the people had seen a thing they could not unsee. They had seen the worthless ground carry them through the death of the good ground, and the scorned woman feed the men who scorned her, and they had learned the hard, slow way a place learns anything, that worth is not in the appearance of a thing, but in what it quietly does. Della bought the bottomland back that year, the very meadow and spring that had been sold off. Her father's debts bought it fair, and paid full price when she could have waited for it to come cheap, because she was done with the arithmetic of taking and had grown fond of the arithmetic of enough. She ran her cattle on the good land and the bad together, and she never again let the good land make her forget what the bad land had taught her. Pyotr Denko lived another 6 years on his sage flat, long enough to see the girl he'd loaned $39 become the steadiest hand in the county, the one the young homesteaders came to the way she'd once come to him. And he told her once, near the end, sitting by the pool in the evening with the swallows dipping to the water, that he had known the day at the pens that she would do well, not because of the cattle, but because of how she'd looked at their feet instead of their ribs. Most people, he said, look at what a thing hasn't got. You looked at what it was standing on. He was speaking of the steers, and he was speaking of the land, and he was speaking of her all at once, the way the old ones do. The land keeps its own counsel, he said again, and pays out only to the one who waits. And Della sat with him by the water she had waited for, and did not need to answer, because being right, in the end, is its own kind of reply, and it does not require any words at all. So, that is the tale, and it ends where a tale should, on a plain image in the last of the light. There is a fold of gravel ground under a broken rimrock in the mussel shell breaks. Ground the surveyors laughed at and the town called a graveyard, and in the deepest draw of it there is a cool, clear eye of water that the worst drought that country ever knew could not close, kept open first by the hooves of 18 starving steers bought for 50 borrowed dollars, and kept open after, by the hands of a woman who had learned to see what a thing was standing on. The cattle still come down to it in the evening, fat and slow and unhurried, and the water still rises between the stones the way it always did, patient and unbothered and sure, in the one place in all that valley where everyone agreed that nothing could ever be. Remember, when someone tells you a thing is worthless, that they may only be telling you they never troubled to look at its feet.